It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce Ms. Jean Slutsky, who for many years directed the Center for Outcomes and Evidence at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, ARC, where she conceived and implemented the Effective Healthcare Program. While there, she was the person responsible, who we call responsible, for Q's formation by suggesting in 2002 that we ask for ARC funding. We received their funding in 2003, and ARC has been funding us with conference grants for more than 10 years. And I want to say I really appreciate you. Recently, Ms. Slutsky, I'm not reading her whole bio because it's in the book, but recently she moved to Pecori. So we now know we have a friend in Pecori, at least one, maybe hundreds. She's now the Chief Engagement and Dissemination Officer at Pecori. She leads Pecori's engagement program and growing dissemination and implementation planning efforts. She also serves as the Director of Pecori's Communication and Dissemination Research Program. Ms. Slutsky.
Thank you. Can you all see me over the podium? I can barely see you. It's actually really a pleasure to be here today for so many reasons. It's okay. I'm short. There's nothing we can really do about it. I've come to grips. I've been come to grips with that. The world is divided into short and tall people. Coming to speak to Q is a special thing for me because not only do Taddy and I go way, way back, but the importance of Q foreshadowed a lot of patient activities within the whole field of evidence-based healthcare. So you all should be very proud of yourselves for the impact you've had and are continuing to have on how science is conducted. So I want to talk to you very briefly because I know there's a lot of questions and answers. I'm going to talk just a little bit about Pecori because I know most of you are familiar with Pecori. You've heard speeches by other folks from Pecori. But I want to emphasize that Pecori exists because there is a gap, and the gap is in how traditional research is done, and the role that the questions are the fact that the questions are often not focused on things that are important to patients, caregivers, and other stakeholders. And then many patients who are enrolled in studies are not necessarily a representative of all patients in the continuum of age, where people live, the type of conditions they may have. And so Pecori's research is really targeted toward what isn't considered traditional research at other research agencies. I often, this is like Mark said, he dug up a slide from 2002. I think this may have come from 2005, but Andy Grove actually was an engineer who invented Intel, and he developed prostate cancer, localized prostate cancer in the mid-90s, and he was very shocked that he had a whole lot of problems getting information about benefits and harms of different treatments. And it's very different than his field of engineering, where people actually publish draft white papers. They're called working papers. They post them for comment. And so he was very frustrated. He came out of his prostate cancer just fine, but later went on to develop Parkinson's disease, and of which he's in the latter stages of that condition now. So that really just I brought that up because both the work that I did at AHRQ and the work I'm doing now at Pecori is really focused on making sure that people who are making decisions in healthcare have the appropriate information at the time that they're making decisions, and that means being involved in the research and the research questions that are studied. So Pecori actually funds comparative effectiveness research. Patient-centered outcomes research is a type of comparative effectiveness research and has the following characteristics as practiced at Pecori, which is that it actively engages patients and key stakeholders what I like to say is from cradle to grave in the research process. And it compares important clinical management options, options that are important to all of the players in the healthcare field, and it evaluates outcomes that are most important to patients. And then addresses implementation of the findings in clinical care environments. So I'm not going to go through this very much because I think you're all familiar with this, but PCORI has a very broad mandate. And not only does it have a mandate to improve decision-making through research and dissemination, but to improve health outcomes. And this mandate will be evaluated in 2017 to determine whether or not PCORI will continue to exist through legislation and funding. So at PCORI, we take this very seriously because obviously we believe really strongly that we do research that's different, that's responsive, and that there's no other entity that fills this gap. So the focus at PCORI is very patient-centered and it answers questions that matter to patients, and it compares outcomes that matter to patients. And the reason I put this up again is to address the fact that I think you wanted me to talk about where is patient engagement going. And one of the things that I found remarkable is that this was sort of a solo act by PCORI for about 2 or 3 years, and now I'm starting to see patient-centered in a lot of different things. In fact, I just got a notice from the Society for Medical Decision-Making, which said we're now inviting patients to participate and present at our annual meeting. We spent an afternoon with FDA at PCORI because they're interested in how to engage patients in regulatory science. We've spent time with our colleagues at the Veterans Administration on how to engage veterans in the design of their healthcare system. So near and dear to me is how we communicate research findings, and this slide actually goes back farther than 2002. I think this goes back into, because I had to scan this, so it wasn't available electronically, so Lord knows how far it goes back. But it really talks about, when and how you communicate information about decision making. So PCORI actually involves patients in, as you know, in a variety of different ways, both in terms of topic nomination, our merit review, evaluation, governance of studies, and implementation. So some key components of this when I talk to researchers, and this is a slide I actually use when I talk to researchers who are either frustrated or have been unsuccessful in getting PCORI research, because they often don't realize that in fact we take many of these features extremely seriously and train our merit reviewers to take it very seriously. And if they don't show that they've actually met these features or have a successful attempt to include these in their study design, they're rejected. And oftentimes I go and give a talk to applicants, and they'll say, I'm not even bothering to submit to PCORI because I won't get funded. Well, in fact, PCORI's funding rate is better than NIH's funding rate and better than AHRQ's funding rate. It's about 12%. And the resubmission funding rate is almost 30%. So if you revise and resubmit your proposal, it's pretty high. So there really is no differential in terms of how much harder PCORI funds. We just base our funding on different criteria. So there are certain characteristics of applications that will receive PCORI funding. But the one thing that I want to highlight, and I highlighted this in red, is that the studies have to include relevant patients and other stakeholders on the research team. And Lorraine talked about the patient and family engagement rubric, and this is actually a template and a guide to help researchers develop their research protocol to include patients and other stakeholders, primarily patients and family caregivers, although it's getting built out for other stakeholders, in a way that walks them through this, because a lot of researchers don't have experience in engagement science. And so this is an attempt to actually make what we want happen in a meaningful way. So one of the things that is important to recognize is that saying that you want patients and stakeholders to be engaged in the research process is different than actually doing it. And there's a science behind it, and there's also needs to be a support behind it. And so PCORI actually is funding methods researched on engagement, as well as providing incubator activities to help researchers engage with communities. We have what are called pipeline to proposal awards, which come in 3 tiers. Tier 1 is exploratory between patient and stakeholder communities and PIs, all the way through Tier 3, which offers protected time and financial support for stakeholder communities and the PI to actually develop a relationship that could, in fact, turn into research questions and a research protocol. One of the things I also wanted to emphasize is the difference between patient-centeredness and patient engagement. So patient-centeredness demonstrates patient involvement and patient centeredness at every stage of the research. And it really is, are we focusing on questions and outcomes that are important to patients? And patient-centered engagement is really the whole involvement of patients and families and caregivers in the actual conduct of the study, from formulating research questions all the way through to making sure the research results get back not only to the whole community, but to the patients who participated as subjects in the study, which many of you know. You could participate in a study and never be informed on what the study results are. So these two things are separable but totally overlapping. And as I said, we're beginning to see these concepts taken up in ways that I don't think anyone ever actually envisioned, both in the literature, in actually the conduct of studies, as well as now conferences that used to only bring researchers together. The Health Technology Assessment International Conference in June had a whole one-day workshop on patient engagement and health technology assessment. And I mentioned what's going on with the Society for Medical Decision-Making Conference. But this is actually, I think we will see a very large shift over time as researchers realize that not involving patients is counterproductive to their main line of business, which is answering research questions that are important and getting funding. So in closing, I just want to talk about the merit review process, because how many of you have been merit reviewers for PCORI applications? Okay. So you know that you're one of 4 reviewers on an application. 2 are technical reviewers, so they are reviewers who have expertise in biostatistics or study design, and then 2 are reviewers that have expertise because they're stakeholders in healthcare, either a patient, a clinician, a payer, a policymaker, but at least one of those stakeholders needs to be a patient. And one of the things that we have found is that the dynamics in those review meetings have changed dramatically from the first rounds, where the chairs didn't know how to deal with dissenting opinions, to now there's almost a collegial, well, what do you think about this? I mean, is this an important question? And reviewing the scores that come in, when I sit down and I look at scores that come in and I compare the scores between the technical reviewers and the stakeholder reviewers, there's much more agreement than there was in the beginning, which tells to me there's a norming going on and a feeling of being comfortable with the different perspectives in the room. Also, the chairs for the committees have become much more comfortable with with making sure that everyone has their say, and has their say in a respectful and trustful way. So I just want to give a final word on dissemination, which one of the things we know is that, and I'm sorry, Mark, you've seen all these slides almost. This one too, I think you've seen. This one came from a Cochrane collaboration talk I gave. Just it was sort of like going through my slides. But you know, I often joke that we always think that researchers are the best people to disseminate, but I think if researchers ruled the world, they'd put food in grocery stores in an alphabetized manner. The holiday sales would be advertised in peer-reviewed journals, and schoolroom size would be directly related to sample size needed for numbers needed to learn. Now, that one's not so far-fetched. I mean, that actually might really be the case. So in closing, contact us, stay with us. We need to have patients engaged in PCORI in meaningful ways, and it takes time, and we realize that. And we need to hear from you when things are working well as when things aren't working well. So I'm happy to answer questions. Did I stay within my time, Patty?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, I see they're all laid out there.
In the work that I have been involved in with the Department of Defense Breast Cancer Research Program, and the way that we use scientists and consumers or survivors working together. And there are two issues I wanted to raise. One is the notion of critical mass of consumers, and we developed the idea of critical mass when we were integrating schools and bringing in one Black person and one Native American, and the importance of critical mass for people feeling comfortable to participate. And the second thing is, how come your major advisory board doesn't have a real patient advocate on it
Well,
in terms of role model?
the second question is, you're talking about the Board of Governors?
Whoever Otis Brawley is on as a patient representative. Will we now do?
They always have, yeah. There's always been 3.
But weren't they all physicians? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, when it was first announced, there were no patient advocates on it, so I'm thrilled that there are now.
If it's the Board of Governors, the Comptroller General of the General Accounting Office names those individuals.
That's who it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a comment that we actually don't have any control over, because
But I hope you take it back in terms of role modeling.
we
because-
have. We've both, we do feedback comments to them when we have open slots. The slots on the Board of Governors for patients are filled. There'll be an announcement today that one of the health services research slots is open, but it has to be filled. The way the legislation is, it has to be filled with a health services researcher. So each slot has a legislative designation.
And then the other one was critical mass in patients.
Yeah, so, that's a great question. I mean, we're fortunate that who heads up our merit review actually was the main contractor for the DOD merit review process. But we have, and the time was limited, so I couldn't really talk about this as much as I'd like to, but there's something called the Ambassadors Program, which now has, I'm trying to think of how many people it has. It's just been in existence for about 7 months. It has about 100 people in it. It's intended to be made up of stakeholders, but the majority are patients. And they meet twice a year, as well as receive training in, similar to this, training about patient advocacy, as well as understanding research and how to become advocates in a research setting, as well as how to make their interests known in peer review meetings and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Years ago, ARC did a practice guideline on treatment of low back pain. And,
How'd you know I was the project officer on that? I mean,
and basically recommended, if I remember correctly, watchful waiting. well, the orthopedists and the chiropractors and everyone else came out of the woodwork and almost dealt a fatal blow to ARC's Practice Guideline Initiative. What, if any, kind of feedback or pushback, I should say, has there been for what you're doing at PCORI?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, that was an interesting time back then. Actually, PCORI has been pretty well received. There's been relatively little, little controversy about what we're doing. Although I will be honest and say we don't have research findings that have come out yet. And that does tend to change people's behavior when you have research findings that come out that either go contrary to popular belief. So I think the big challenge with low back pain is many people thought that watchful waiting was bad. Now everyone's saying, watchful waiting is not such a bad thing, and so it takes time for the public and including organized medicine, to look at things that go against conventional beliefs. And but we are in a bit of a honeymoon period right now where we have not, we've been criticized more for not taking on direct head-to-head studies, which we are now doing through our pragmatic clinical studies program, than we have for anything we have done. So I'm knocking on wood, but we haven't seen that same pushback. And I will say, I led a comparative effectiveness research program at AHRQ, and we didn't get that horrible pushback either. And I think a good part of that was because it was a very transparent process and very inclusionary. So everything was put up for public comment. There wasn't a black hole. So times have changed in terms of how processes are communicated. I think science in general is more transparent now than it was, 20 years ago.
Hi there. When you say that there's a patient stakeholder on the review panel, is it a patient with a condition that the proposal relates to, or is it just a patient with any condition? And I wonder if an issue comes up with, is a patient, or if somebody with Alzheimer's disease is able to, serve as as an appropriate evaluator for a diabetic proposal, and vice versa.
Yeah, so just like with technical reviewers, it's not always possible to match someone who has exact technical expertise with the number of applications that come through the panel. So each panel could review up to 30 applications in the panel. So there's more than one patient advocate, or they're not all advocates. There's some of them are patients that have given of their time to be reviewers. So there's probably I'd have to count it up, but there's probably a half to a third of the panel are stakeholders, and the rest are technical reviewers. And we try to make sure that when we see the slate of proposals that are coming through, that we match the expertise and the experiences as best we can with the applications. But the diversity of the applications are such that it's challenging. Now, where we do a better job of that, and that's true of most funding agencies, is when we do a targeted solicitation for applications, then we know, that we're targeting, let's say, obesity or hypertension, then it's much easier because all the applications will be dealing with obesity or hypertension.
But I've also seen that some of the same patient reps are on everywhere.
Yeah.
There are a few, really a handful of people. You see them all the time, and for whatever, for better or worse. And I just wondered, to what extent is PCORI interested in training patient advocates outside of PCORI, or is your focus really on training people to work within the PCORI system?
Yeah, right now, we're really focused on getting as diverse a group of patients working with PCORI as possible. So you probably know that we have a patient engagement advisory panel that Lorraine sits on, who has helped us, develop processes and procedures for doing that, as well as training programs. And training programs for researchers, because what we want researchers to do, if it's a small study, we want them to reach out to their community, right? So you want people in the community to be engaged with a researcher who's doing research in the community. So a lot of our programs are really targeted to making that relationship, a matchmaking relationship, so to speak. And for larger, pragmatic clinical studies that, are, $10 million or $15 million in scope, we not only want people in the community to be involved, but we want national organizations to be involved, because these are much more likely to be influential studies on their own. And so we want those findings to be important and influential, but also have a home when they're completed.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, I know.
Hi. How can I ask this so you won't feel it's putting you on the spot? I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but it seems like we aren't asking an obvious question, which is there a role for Q at PCORI?
Sure. So, there is, and, I've been somewhat of an entrepreneur about ways to fund activities like this. So, PCORI has something called the Eugene Washington Engagement Awards, which are awards that are not intended to be research awards, but they're awards that are intended to transfer knowledge, to help in dissemination, or to engage the public in PCORI activities. And you should look at the funding page for that and see whether or not the goals of Q are consistent with that funding mechanism. And if you think it is, then I would suggest submitting a letter of intent. And the person you would submit the letter, or any questions you would have, is, I think you might know Leah Hodgkiss. And you submit your letter of intent electronically, but she could answer any questions that you have. So there are mechanisms for funding organizations like Q, and we've funded individuals in this room to do things that promote the goals of PCORI through this mechanism in the past.
Thank you very
Yeah.
much. And I really want to, you're one of my sheroes, even
No.
though I can ask tough questions. I really want to thank you for all you've done for all of us in terms of patient engagement, legitimizing it. Thank you.